The final section of our nutrient requirements is going to be covering reproduction. When we talk about the reproductive cycle in breeding females, we need to understand that it includes three phases: the breeding season itself, gestation, and into lactation. And so when you're talking about repro cycle management, it's all three phases. The challenge is that a lot of times these three phases overlap each other. Females may require nutrients to support several processes happening at the same time. An example of this is her own growth. Many of the young females that are getting ready to be in their first parity or having their first offspring are still growing themselves, and so they need to take into account their own growth, as well as what's happening during the gestation and lactation. Many females, when they're in lactation, or maybe being asked to breed again, or those kinds of things, and so you've got to balance multiple processes all at the same time, which can be a challenge. And so making sure nutrient requirements are met for all different phases is going to help a manager control the different processes. An example of this is if you take a look at the cycle of the broodmare. Because she has such a long gestation period, she is potentially breeding and gestating at the same time that she's lactating. And so all of that is happening is a tremendous drain on the energy reserves of the body, and she must be managed accordingly. When we talk about the breeding season, one of the first things we need to do was talk about the animal reaching puberty. Generally, faster growth means the faster that an animal reaches its size for breeding. Most species involve a critical body weight for cycling. In the ruminants, it's about 60 to 70%, usually around 65% of their mature weight, they're going to be ready to breed or start cycling. General rule of thumb for most producers is that the earlier attainment of breeding status can be an economic advantage. The animal becomes productive sooner and may have some longevity in terms of production. An example of this is getting beef cows to calve at 2 years of age instead of 3 years of age. They tend to have more offspring and wean more pounds over their lifetime than those that are start calving at 3 years of age. Some of the disadvantages, though, is that if you go too fast and ask these females to hit puberty too soon, you're going to see decreased mammary development. Essentially, fat cells replace mammary tissue and reduces lifetime milk production in these females. You may see reduced productive lifespan because of fat deposition or something else happening in the body, and there is a risk of early embryonic death in these females if they've been asked to gain too fast and hit puberty too early. The rest of their body's not quite ready to handle it. Feeding management before and during the breeding season is very important because that's sometimes where it's easiest to change their body condition and get them ready for late gestation and going into lactation. If an animal's in good body condition going into the breeding season, you're more likely to have conceptions, and in the case of litter-bearing species, increased numbers of animals being born. The challenge is if those animals are lactating at the same time you're asking them to breed, it's going to be a bigger challenge to get them in good body condition if they don't start out there. It's going to be hard to make up the difference, so to speak. If you take a look at the pictures that are on the screen, you'll notice that these animals are very thin. These animals are at risk for not rebreeding during lactation because all of their energy and nutrients that they're consuming is going to milk production and not to their own body tissues healing and preparing for that next breeding season or that next gestation. One useful tool in livestock production, especially in small ruminants such as sheep and goats, and sometimes in dairy cattle as well, is the practice of what we call flushing. It's not what the picture's indicating. It's simply the increased plane of nutrition going into a breeding season, and it can be something as simple as changing pastures to a higher quality pasture, adding some supplement, a little bit of energy into their diet going into the breeding season. For sheep and goats, the typical rule of thumb is you start flushing about 2 to 3 weeks before breeding and into the first 2 to 3 weeks of the breeding season to make sure that animal is gaining weight or improving condition and not on a downhill slide. You tend to see increased breeding success. Usually this comes in the form of increased ovulation rates and increased conceptions. If animals are already in good body condition going into the breeding season, maintaining good body condition is just as effective. But if you have animals that are slightly below average body condition going into the breeding season, that is when flushing is a very important tool and very effective in helping improve conception rates during that breeding season. Specific nutrients can affect fertility. In general, any nutrient deficiency can affect fertility just because it's going to affect overall health. If they're not getting general nutrient needs like protein, energy coming from the carbohydrates or fats, then it's just one of those, it's going to affect the general health of the animal, and that's going to in turn affect fertility. Just because you feed extra of a nutrient doesn't mean it's going to enhance fertility. It's one of those things that when you feed extra, you've got to make sure the nutrients are in balance with each other. Feeding extra does not ensure fertility. It's making sure nutrients are balanced and the animals are able to utilize the nutrients in the proper ratio for whatever you're asking them to do. In general, our nutritional goals for breeding include feeding for good body condition. You want these females to be in good to average to slightly above average body condition, and making sure that minimal nutrient requirements are being met. From breeding, once those animals move into gestation, maintenance is still first and foremost. All of these females have a maintenance requirement. Then we need to start considering the rate of placental growth and fetal growth and how that's going to impact nutrient requirements. The placenta tends to develop during the first 2/3 of a gestation period, regardless of species. That's when we see most of the placental growth. It's still not a huge drain during that early to mid gestation period like the fetal growth will be. The majority of the fetal growth is going to happen during that last third of gestation. We also need to consider during that last third of gestation mammary development and as the body prepares for the lactation cycle. Finally, we need to think about, is there any carryover of growth or lactation previously that we need to consider during this gestation phase? If you think back to any first parity animals that are getting ready to have their first offspring, they may still be growing themselves, and we need to consider that. Let's take a look at the fetal growth curve, and we have parturition there on the right-hand side of the screen. Right in the center is where we start seeing the first 2/3 of gestation versus the last third of gestation. The line that we see in the center is the increasing development of the fetus. Early on, the fetal and placental growth is not a huge drain. It's at a slower growth rate. But during that last third of gestation, it increases rapidly, and that's when the most nutrient demand on the female's body is going to occur during gestation. That first 2/3, we're essentially feeding these animals at a maintenance level, maybe just a touch above maintenance, but in general, maintenance is sufficient to meet the needs during that first 2/3 of gestation. As they move into that last third, we do see increased nutrient requirements for all nutrients, and we need to make sure that female is being prepared to enter lactation. During gestation, if you have inadequate nutrition, whether it's an imbalance of nutrients, not enough nutrients, whatever the situation is, you're going to see embryonic loss, abortions, and possibly stillbirths. The fetus has that priority over the female for nutrients, and that fetus will take them at the expense of the dam or mother. And so that dam is going to be more affected by the deficiencies in the fetus, and she's going to sacrifice her own tissues, fat, muscle, and potentially bone to nourish that fetus. The level of nutrition has some effect on fetal size, but genetics is going to be more important in that level. A lot of times people say, oh, well, if you feed them too much, you're going to get big calves or whatever the case is. Genetics is still the most important parameter in that. Nutrition may have a small effect in there, but understand genetics is going to be more important. Basically, our nutritional goals for gestation are going to be avoid overfeeding during that early gestation. When they're just needing a maintenance level feed or just slightly above, we don't want to overfeed them during that time frame and get them too fat. But we also want to make sure we avoid underfeeding during late gestation, as that body is preparing for lactation. Her nutrient demands are going up because of that fetal growth. The ideal condition is to have that dam or female in good condition or good flesh at the time of parturition, meaning birth, without being too fat. And so that's going to be a bit of a challenge. You want to make sure she's in good flesh, but not too fat. You can sometimes run into risks with ketosis and other lambing paralysis and some other disorders if they are too fat going into parturition. Lactation is another area, is the third phase of the reproductive cycle that takes a major demand on the body and increases the nutrient requirements dramatically. Most of the factors affecting nutrient requirements are going to be, again, we have that maintenance requirement. Maintenance has to be met before the body can use nutrients for any other purpose. Milk yield, how much milk is being produced, is going to affect how many requirements and what nutrient requirements that female needs. The milk composition, different species have different compositions of milk, and even within species, like within dairy cows, Jersey cows have a different milk composition from Holstein cows. And so if a female produces more fat in the milk, she's going to require more of those precursors in her diet to be able to produce that desired composition. Are they gestating as well? Are we getting ready to rebreed them, as is in the case of most beef cattle or dairy cattle? When we talk about milk yield, we need to understand that it varies with breed, age, stage of lactation, early lactation, mid-lactation, or late lactation, and that it's gonna, and so we need to understand all these parameters and know our animals when we start feeding for milk production. If we take a look at a generalized lactation curve, most females are going to peak at the front third of the lactation, and then there's a steady decline of milk production up until the point of weaning or drying off. Peak milk production usually comes, like in dairy cattle, it's about 2 months post-calving or a month and a half post-calving, and then there's that steady decline afterwards. When we feed animals during lactation, during early lactation, we need to know that milk production rises faster than food intake. The animal has to adjust to consuming more feed to handle milk production. And so there's what I call a lag time, where production lags behind feed intake. So during that time, the female usually has to draw on her own body reserves, whether it's for fat or even possibly calcium stores, until that feed intake catches up. So body condition is extremely important, as it essentially becomes part of the diet. Sorry, ignore my little text message up in the top corner. When we enter lactation and have those females entering lactation, they need to enter in good body condition, because we know that they're going to utilize some of their body reserves as nutrients. The classic example is the lactating dairy cow. She physically cannot consume enough feed to support her milk production during that early peak milk production phase up until her intake catches up with it. She's going to be drawing on her body reserves. Let's take a look at this from a diagram standpoint. The solid line is milk production. The larger dotted line that's right below it is feed intake. The line on the bottom, it can either be body weight or body condition. In this case, it's body weight. So what we see is during that early lactation phase, when we see milk production is ahead of feed intake. Feed intake is low, and so as a result, that female's drawing on her body stores. She's losing body weight because she's utilizing that fat reserve she had going into lactation. Once feed intake matches production and catches up, you notice that she starts healing and body weight starts to gain again as lactation declines, intake's going to decline, and the body's allowed to recover in condition. Basically, when we get down towards the end of lactation and intake becomes greater than production, that's when we see an animal gain weight. We'll talk about it more in the dairy side of it, but it's actually sometimes more efficient to have that cow put on condition now during that late lactation phase as opposed to during the dry period. And we'll talk about why when we hit the dairy side of it. One of the challenges is when we're rebreeding those dairy cows, notice that it's right during peak production, feed intake hasn't quite caught up yet. And so if we're rebreeding early on there, it's something we need to consider from the demands on that female's body. So during early lactation, it may be impossible to get that animal to eat enough to prevent weight loss, especially in the dairy females. So we need to understand that they are going to lose condition, and that's okay, as long as it's not excessive. And she is allowed to gain that weight back later in lactation. So weight loss is okay, but they've got to be able to gain it back, and usually that's going to happen in mid to late lactation. During late lactation, we know milk production is declining. It's going to be easier to meet her nutrient requirements, and that's the time period we want to improve body condition. One of the final things we need to visit about regarding lactation is colostrum, which is the first product from the mammary gland following parturition. Colostrum is very rich in protein and minerals, and especially immunoglobulins, or immunity, for that newborn offspring. And so it is imperative that mammals receive the colostrum from their mother because of that transfer of immunity. It is a little bit lower in lactose, so it does have a different composition from the milk that's going to be following. It's a very different product. If you've ever seen colostrum, you know it's kind of a thick, yellowy type liquid, and it's much different from the milk product that you'll see 48 to 72 hours later after parturition.